Death March, 1945, Chapter 27. From Gross-Rosen we were to be moved again, this time to a camp called Dachau, and once more we would walk. It was late in the winter, almost spring, but the ground was still frozen and the snow hadn't melted. The wooden clogs I wore were terrible for crossing icy patches and clomping through snowdrifts, but I was still better off than those who had lost their shoes or never had any to begin with. If you could keep good care of your feet in the camps, especially on the marches, you could survive. The sides of the road were littered with the dead bodies of Jews who had marched this way before us. They were blue and frozen, lumped into the ditches alongside of the road so cars could still pass. Their bodies were a constant reminder to keep up pace. As we walked past the frozen corpses, I wondered who else uses this road. Somebody else had to, surely, somebody beside the German army. Who were these people who passed the bodies of dead Jews in ditches every day on their way to work into town or on their way into work? How could they not see what was happening? How could they be all right with this? Along the way, we passed through villages and suburbs. Little houses lined the roads, houses with painted shutters and wreaths on the doors. Electric lights lit the windows, and inside we could sometimes see a family sitting down to listen to the radio together or washing dishes in the kitchen. Every now and then a doorway hung a Nazi flag, bright red with a black swastika in a white circle. It was warning enough that we should keep our heads down and stay quiet as we passed through. The route from Gross-Rosen to Dachau, north of Munich, took us through Czechoslovakia and back into Germany again. Czechoslovakia was still held by Germany. It had been one of the first countries to fall at the start of the war, but the homes we passed now were Czech, not German. Germany had conquered them, but they didn't make them love the Germans anymore. If anything, the Czechs hated their Nazi overlords. There was a change in the SS officers guarding us when we crossed into Czechoslovakia. They still walked like they owned the place, but they were more wary, watching the doorways and crossroads for any signs of trouble. There were no Nazi flags welcome here. No Czech revolutionary jumped out from behind the bushes to free us, but the Czech people fought back in less violent ways. In one little village there was bread left out on a windowsill. Bread! One of the prisoners saw it and ran for it. Others joined him, and the bread was gone before the Nazis could yell at them to stop. I saw a loaf of bread on the doorstep of another house, but it was gone before I could get it, snatched up by starving prisoners and devoured on the spot. Every Czech village we passed had some little food set out, not nearly enough for us all, and not nearly enough for those lucky enough to get a bite to eat, but it was something. Farther inside Czechoslovakia, some of the villagers hung out of their windows to throw whatever they had to us: crusts of bread, half-eaten apples, raw potatoes. The Czechs couldn't share much. There was a war going on after all, and food was hard to come by. But their kindness in the face of the Nazi soldiers and their guns warmed my heart. It was easy to think that the worst of humanity when all I saw was brutality and selfishness, and these people showed me that there is still good in this world, even if I rarely saw it. The capos took as much of the food as they could for themselves, but a little still made it into our hands and the mouths of the prisoners. The SS officers were mad about that, but they yelled at the Czechs, not us Jews. "Can't you see you're helping traitors to the fatherland?" they cried. The Czechs didn't care. Germany wasn't their fatherland, and how were we Jews traitors anyways? What had we done other than exist? We marched on for the 3 days, and I still hadn't been lucky enough to get any food from the kind-hearted Czechs. I was starving, and I knew I would die of hunger before the cold got me. I was already struggling to keep ahead of the prisoners at the back of the column. Any farther back, and I would wind up one of the frozen Jews on the roadside with a bullet in my head. There was a capo in front of me with 4 big loaves of Czech bread slung over his shoulder in a cloth sack. I stared at the bread as I walked, imagining having such a feast. 4 loaves. That bread would go bad before the capos ever ate all 4 loaves. The capos were healthier and better fed than the rest of us, but they still were not as well fed as the Nazis. He couldn't possibly eat all that much and not get sick. What if I could talk him into giving me some? Not every capo was a monster. I summoned what little strength I had left and moved closer to the capo. I couldn't speak to him now, here, on the road. There were too many other capos around. But maybe if I stayed close to him, made him see me as a real person, the way the Czech saw us, maybe when I asked him for bread, he would take pity on me and give me some of his hoard. I sidled up along the capo, but when I saw his face, I gasped. It was Moonface. Moonface, the capo who had beaten me whenever he could at Bergen-Belsen. Somehow he'd been transferred to Gross Rosen, and now he was marching south with us to Dachau. Moonface turned and would have seen me, but I quickly backed away. What terrible luck! I wanted to cry again. So much bread, so much more bread than one person needed, and it was Moonface who held it all. Moonface would never give it to me or anyone else. He was too cruel. But as I trudged along, I couldn't help staring at that sack of bread. If I didn't get food by the end of the day, I would die. I knew it. My arms shook on their own, and the green spiky leaves and toxic red berries of hollies growing alongside the road started to look appetizing. I'd be eating poisonous fruit and bark by nightfall if I didn't get some of that bread. I marched up beside Moonface again, my hunger making me brave. What could Moonface do to me that hunger and the cold weren't already doing? I walked right alongside him until he looked down and saw me. I smiled at him, trying to make him remember me not as the boy he used to punch in the face, but as one of the best workers at Bergen-Belsen. Moonface frowned at me like he was trying to remember who I was, and then he ignored me. I did everything I could to get his attention short of talking to him. I crossed back and forth in front of him. I walked right beside him on his left and right, matching him step for step. When he walked faster, I walked faster. Even though my feet were sore and frozen and my legs were so weak they wanted to quit, I wouldn't let them, not yet. That nightfall, we stopped in a field. I watched where Moonface went, away from the other capos. Maybe he didn't want to share with them either. Moonface opened his sack and pulled out one of the loaves of his bread, and I inched closer. I glanced around to make sure none of the other capos were watching. If they saw me, if they heard what I was about to ask, Moonface would beat me to death. He would have to save face, but Moonface had sat far enough away from the other capos that they didn't notice me. The other people around were the mute, living skeletons, my fellow prisoners. I moved close enough to stand over Moonface, and he looked up at me with a scared, pitted, round face. I faltered. This was the face I had avoided so often at Bergen-Belsen. This was the face that I had fled to Gross Rosen to avoid. Moonface would beat me senseless for what I wanted to ask him, but what choice did I have? I cleared my throat and spoke for the first time in days. "Do you remember me?" I croaked. Moonface grunted and tore a bit of bread off with his teeth. "If you remember me," I said, my voice cracking, "then you know I'm a good worker." The other prisoners on the ground looked around at us and up at me with wide eyes. They must have been thinking the same thing I had, that Moonface would kill me just for talking to him. I pushed on before my courage left me. I want to work, but I won't make it on the march another day if I don't get some bread. I haven't eaten in 3 days, and I was hoping you could give me some." Moonface stared at me, his mouth slowly chewing on the bread like a cow working its cud. I would be able to work," I told him, "but I can't work without food." Moonface laid his bread aside and pulled out a knife. He stood and put it against my throat. I tried not to flinch, but I could feel where the knife nicked my skin. Blood from the cut ran down my neck, and the prisoners around me seemed to hold their breath, waiting for me to die. Or maybe it was me holding my breath. I couldn't tell. All I could do was stand there, as tall and as strong as possible, and wait for Moonface to decide my fate. Moonface held the knife against my neck, staring into my eyes. I stared right back, showing him how strong I was, showing him I wasn't afraid to die. Neither of us blinked. After a long minute went by, if he was going to kill me, I wished he would just get it over with. I was ready to scream. At last, Moonface pulled the knife away from my neck, and I breathed again. To my amazement and to the amazement of the other prisoners watching us, Moonface cut a hunk of the loaf of bread with his knife and tossed the bread to me. A murmur of surprise went through the prisoners around us, but Moonface silenced them all with a glare. I nodded my thanks to his big, ugly capo, and I hurried away before he changed his mind and killed me. My heart was racing as I found a place to lie down and eat. With shaking fingers, I tore off a small piece and lifted it to my cracked lips. No bread has ever tasted so good in my life. I wanted to eat it all right then and there, but there was no telling how much farther I would have to walk. I had to save as much as I could. Moonface had found it in his heart to be generous once, for whatever reason, but just this once. Chapter 28. We marched another 3 days before we crossed back into Germany. The Czech people continued to help us as much as they could along the way, but once we were back in Germany, the doors in the villages were closed to us again, and the window shades were pulled tight. If the Germans didn't see us, they didn't have to think about us, but we left enough dead bodies in the ditches that they would know that we had been through. I made my bread last as long as I could, but there was no way I could march for another 3 days. Neither could any of the other prisoners from the look of our ragged ranks. How close was Dachau? How much longer would it take us to get there? Would any of us be alive to see it? The Nazis must have been thinking the same thing. On the afternoon of the 6th day, we came to a tiny depot where a train waited for us. The capos split us up, Jews in one train car, Poles in another, and we were loaded on. In the third car, Nazis loaded in wooden crates. Our documents, one of the other prisoners told me. They send them along with us wherever we go. The monsters. They like to keep track of who they kill and how they do it. It seemed like an awful lot of trouble to go through for traitors of the fatherland. The cattle car was crowded and unsanitary like all the rest, and there was no food or water but what we had brought with us. At least we weren't walking anymore, which was a small mercy. A day and a night passed in the train. I drifted in and out of sleep, swaying on my aching feet, but I was awakened with the sound of an explosion. Kaboom! It was close enough to rattle the car. Planes droned overhead. Russian? American? British? I had no idea. But the bombs were dropping all around us. Boom! Boom! Kaboom! The last of them hit so close we were all thrown forward. The train's brakes screeched as it slammed to a halt, and we all struggled to look out through the slats and see what had happened. Soon word came to us from the Polish car behind us. The last car on the train had been hit with the bomb. No one had been hurt, but the car that held all of our documents was destroyed. Ha! Someone laughed humorously. How will the Hitlerites know who they're killing now? Easy, someone else said. They'll know because they put all the Jews in one car and all the Poles in that car. When we get to Dachau, they'll just gas us and put the others to work. He was probably right. They didn't know our names anymore, but we still had our Jewish stars on our uniforms, ragged and torn as they were, and we were all in the Jewish car. As long as they kept us together, they could herd us right into the gas chambers, which gave me an idea. I found the Jewish star on my jacket. It was dirty and falling apart. Remembering the work sewing uniforms, I ripped at the seams and still held on to my jacket until I could rip it off. They'll kill you for that, the man next to me said, watching me. They'll kill him for wearing it too, another man said. I didn't listen. I had a plan. The place where the star had been sewn onto was cleaner and newer looking than anywhere else on the jacket, and you could still see the outline of the star. That would give me away for sure. I slipped my jacket off and put it on the floor, rubbing it around with my foot. When I picked it back up, it was filthy all over, including the place where the star had been. Good. Now at least I would look the part. When the train finally stopped outside of Dachau, we were taken out of the cattle cars. As the Jews and Poles got off beside one another, I slipped from one group to the other. If the Nazis had lost our records, they wouldn't know I was a Jew unless I was standing with the Jews. One of the other Poles saw me switching sides, and he frowned at me. I worked my way farther into the group and I waited, my heart thumping. If I got caught, I would be killed. I remembered how, back home in Krakow, people sometimes mistook me for a Gentile. I hoped the Nazis would be fooled. The SS officers made us line up and tell them our prisoner names and numbers. Prisoner B3087, I told them. My name is Jan Zielony. Zielony meant green in Polish. My real last name, Gruner, meant greener in German. Zielony made me sound more Polish, and it was easy to remember. Nazi wrote down my name and number and nodded me on. I have done it. I am no longer a Jew to the Nazis. I was going to live. That boy's a Jew, someone said. It was the man who had seen me cross over. He pointed at me. He came over from the other car when he got here. The blood drained from my face. A capo grabbed me and raised his club to hit me. Wait, I cried. I was born Jewish, but I never practiced. I lied. I never went to synagogue. All my friends were Poles, Christian Poles. I went to church with them. I am not a Jew. If you were born a Jew, you're a Jew, the SS officer said. He marked through my name on his sheet. Put him with the others where he belongs. The capo shoved me along to the group of watching Jews. None of them had said a word, not even the men who had seen me take off my Star of David. When the capo had pushed me back among my people, I turned to look at the Pole who had ratted me out. He kept his eyes on the ground and wouldn't look at me. Why had he done it? What difference did it make? It's not like I would have eaten food he could have eaten or slept in his bed that he could have slept on. I was nothing to him, nor him to me. And yet he told on me when there was nothing to be gained by it. He told on me for no reason other than I was a Jew. The Nazis took our names and numbers and made new documents for us to replace the ones that had been destroyed on the march to Dachau. They would need them so they could keep track of how they killed us all.